My name is Tessa Marrow, and at 35, I still catch glimpses of a woman I recognize in the bathroom mirror every morning. Standing in our small house in Tidehaven, Washington, I adjust the neckline of my emerald sweater, its soft fabric hugging my curves, while my auburn hair falls in ways I've spent 20 minutes perfecting with a curling iron. The reflection staring back has bright hazel eyes, a sharp jawline, and a smile I've learned to wear like armor, but beneath it, I feel a restless ache I can't name. My husband, Roland Marrow, 52, has settled into a life that feels like a slow fade, his once vibrant energy now buried under routine, leaving me invisible in our own home. He used to surprise me with impromptu hikes through the misty forests, his hand warm in mine, whispering promises that made my skin flush, but now he barely glances up from his tablet. Every evening, Roland sinks into his armchair, scrolling through news apps or watching documentaries about shipwrecks, while I linger in the doorway, hoping for a spark that never comes. I dress carefully, tailored jeans, delicate earrings, a spritz of jasmine perfume, because I want to feel alive, but Roland's indifference stings like salt in a wound I can't stop picking. Out in Tidehaven, a sleepy town of cedar-shingled houses and rocky beaches, people notice me, like Mr. Callahan at the bookstore, who compliments my scarf with a grin that warms my cheeks. Their words remind me I'm not fading, that my efforts aren't wasted, but at home, I'm a ghost, haunting a marriage that's grown too comfortable to question. Yet, there's one person whose gaze feels different, heavier, and it's my 17-year-old son, Gideon Marrow, who watches me in a way that both comforts and unsettles my heart. Gideon's always been my shadow, ever since he was a boy, trailing me through Tidehaven's farmer's market, his small hand clutching mine tightly. Now, at 17, he's tall, with messy chestnut curls and slate-gray eyes that seem to see straight through the walls I've built around my feelings. We talk about everything: his dream of studying marine biology, his frustration with calculus, the girls at school he dismisses because they don't understand his quiet intensity. But lately, his attention has shifted, like a tide turning, and I catch him staring when I pour coffee or fold laundry, his gaze lingering too long on my silhouette. Last week, as I stood in the kitchen slicing apples for a pie, he leaned against the counter, his voice soft, saying my new boots looked sharp with my jeans. I laughed, brushing it off, telling myself it's just Gideon being sweet, but the warmth in his tone made my pulse quicken in a way I didn't want to examine. He started noticing things Roland misses, like the silver bracelet I bought on a whim, or the way I've been wearing my hair up to keep it off my neck. Each compliment feels like a pebble dropped in still water, rippling through me, stirring something dangerous I try to ignore because I'm his mother, not a woman craving attention. I tell myself it's nothing, that I'm reading too much into his words, but deep down I know something's changing, and I'm not sure I want to stop it. Every night, I lie beside Roland, his snores filling the dark, while I stare at the ceiling, wondering why I feel so alone in a house full of people. One morning, as I stood at the stove stirring oatmeal, the scent of cinnamon filling our cozy kitchen, Gideon walked in, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He paused in the doorway, watching me with a half-smile, then said my sweater made my eyes look like the sea after a storm, vivid and alive. I froze, the wooden spoon still in my hand, my cheeks flushing because no one said anything that poetic to me in years, not even Roland. I mumbled something about needing to check the laundry, escaping to the basement, where I pressed my hands against the cool washing machine, trying to steady my breathing. Gideon's words stayed with me all day, looping through my mind as I rang up customers at the bookstore, their weight both thrilling and terrifying, like a secret I hadn't meant to uncover. When I got home, Roland was already in his armchair, engrossed in a podcast about lost submarines, not noticing the new scarf I'd tied around my neck with care. I stood in the living room, waiting for him to look up, to see me, but he didn't, and the silence between us felt heavier than the fog rolling off the Pacific. Gideon, though, saw everything. When I wore lipstick, when I switched my earrings, when I laughed at his jokes, and his attention was a light I hadn't realized I had been chasing in the dark. I started to dread the moments we were alone, not because I didn't trust him, but because I wasn't sure I trusted myself to keep the lines clear. By the time I crawled into bed that night, my mind was a tangle of guilt and longing, and I wondered how I'd let things drift so far from safe shores. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray clouds hanging low over Tidehaven, when everything shifted, like a fault line cracking beneath my feet. I was in the dining room, sorting through a stack of bills, the rain tapping softly against the windows, when Gideon burst through the front door, his face lit with a mix of amusement and something sharper. He dropped his backpack on the floor, his sneakers squeaking on the hardwood, and announced that I wouldn't believe what had happened at school during his lunch period today. I set down the electric bill, my curiosity piqued, and asked what he meant, my voice steady despite the nervous flutter in my chest I couldn't explain. Gideon paced the room, his hands gesturing wildly, and told me he'd been sitting in the cafeteria when he overheard some guys at the next table laughing over a phone. One of them, a junior named Derek, was showing off a picture, and when Gideon glanced over, he saw my face on the screen, clear as day, in a photo from my Instagram. It was a shot I'd posted last month, me in a navy dress by the pier, the wind catching my hair, nothing special, just a moment I'd liked. My stomach twisted as Gideon described how Derek's friends were grinning, making comments about how I looked, their voices low and conspiratorial, like they'd found something they shouldn't have. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles whitening, and asked if he was sure it was me, hoping maybe he'd mistaken someone else for his mother. Gideon stepped closer, his eyes narrowing, and said he'd know me anywhere, that it was definitely my photo, the one where I'd captioned it, "Chasing Tides," and he wasn't imagining things. I felt the air shift, like the room had shrunk, and asked what he'd done next, my voice barely above a whisper because I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Gideon grinned, a sharp, proud edge to it, and said he'd leaned over and asked Derek why he had a picture of his mom on his phone, his tone cold enough to silence the table. Derek had stammered, his face paling, claiming he'd just stumbled across it online and thought I looked cool, but Gideon wasn't buying it, not for a second. I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth, and told him he shouldn't have confronted them like that it could have escalated into something worse at school. Gideon shrugged, his jaw tight, and said he didn't care. He wasn't about to let some random guys pass around my photo like it was theirs to keep or comment on. Then he admitted, his voice dropping, that he'd snatched Derek's phone right out of his hand to check if there were more pictures of me saved in his gallery. My eyes widened, shock mixing with a strange warmth, and I scolded him, saying he couldn't just grab someone's phone, that it was reckless, even if he meant to protect me. He crossed his arms, unapologetic, and said it was just the one photo, but it still felt wrong, like those guys didn't have the right to look at me that way, to talk about me. I pressed my fingers to my temples, trying to process it all, and asked why it bothered him so much, though I wasn't sure I was ready for the honesty in his answer. Gideon's gaze locked onto mine, fierce and unwavering, and he said I wasn't just some woman to him. I was his mom, and he'd do whatever it took to make sure people respected me. The room felt too small, the rain outside too loud, and I stood up, muttering about needing to start dinner to break the tension swirling between us. As I moved to the kitchen, my hands trembling while I pulled pots from the cabinet, I couldn't shake the image of Gideon standing up for me, his voice cutting through the noise of that cafeteria. It was the kind of protectiveness I hadn't felt from Roland in years, maybe ever, and it stirred something deep in me, a gratitude laced with unease I didn't want to name. That night, as I lay beside Roland, his back turned to me, his breathing heavy and oblivious, I replayed Gideon's words, his fierce defense, and wondered why it made my heart race in ways it shouldn't. I told myself it was pride, that any mother would feel this way about a son who cared so deeply, but the truth was murkier, and I hated myself for even thinking it. Sleep didn't come easily, the rain tapping against the window like a warning, and I knew something had shifted, a line blurring that I wasn't sure I could redraw. The days that followed were heavy with an awareness I couldn't shake, like a fog that clung to everything I did around Gideon. He started bringing me small things, a latte from the CAF I loved, a bookmark he'd found at the thrift store, saying it reminded him of the novels I read. Each gesture was thoughtful, deliberate, and I'd thank him, my voice light, but inside I felt the weight of his attention piling up like stones I didn't know how to carry. One evening, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, the soapy water warm against my hands, Gideon came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my shoulders in a hug that felt too familiar. I laughed, leaning back slightly, and asked what that was for, my tone teasing to mask the flutter in my chest I didn't want to acknowledge. He didn't let go right away, his chin resting lightly on my shoulder, and said he just felt like it, that he liked seeing me smile when I wasn't expecting it. My breath caught, the dish sponge still in my hand, and I gently pulled away, turning to face him, searching his face for something I wasn't sure I'd find or wanted to. Gideon's eyes twinkled with mischief, and he announced he had a surprise planned for tomorrow, something I'd love, but he wouldn't give me any hints except to be ready by noon. I raised an eyebrow, drying my hands on a towel, and asked what kind of surprise he was scheming, half expecting him to dodge the question with that lopsided grin of his. He just smirked, backing toward the hallway, and said I'd have to trust him, that it was the kind of thing I'd never forget, no matter what. The next morning, I stood in my bedroom, staring at my closet, my fingers lingering on a sundress I hadn't worn in years, wondering if it was too much for whatever Gideon had planned. I settled on a teal swimsuit under a light cardigan and jeans, practical but still flattering, because part of me wanted to feel good, even if I wouldn't admit why. Gideon met me by the front door, dressed in cargo shorts and a faded t-shirt, his excitement contagious as he grabbed the car keys and told me to hurry up. We drove through Tidehaven, the cedar trees blurring past, and I tried to guess where we were going, asking if it was the lighthouse or maybe the new ice cream shop by the marina. He shook his head, his grin widening, and said it was better than anything I'd come up with, his hands tapping the steering wheel to a song only he could hear. When we pulled into a gravel lot by the harbor, the ocean stretching gray and endless before us, I saw the sign for kayak rentals and felt a jolt of memory I hadn't touched in years. Years ago, I'd mentioned to Gideon, half joking, how I'd always wanted to kayak along the coast, to feel the water carry me, but life, bills, work, Roland, had always gotten in the way. I turned to him, my mouth parting, and asked if he'd remember that conversation, my voice softer than I meant because I was afraid of what his answer might mean. Gideon nodded, his eyes warm, and said he never forgot the things I said, not the important ones, and he'd been saving up to make this happen for me. My throat tightened, a lump forming, and I followed him to the dock, where a bright yellow tandem kayak bobbed gently in the water, waiting for us like a promise. The instructor gave us life jackets, explaining the basics, but I barely listened, my gaze fixed on Gideon as he adjusted the straps on my vest with careful hands, his fingers brushing my shoulders. We climbed in, me in front, Gideon behind, and as we pushed off, the paddle felt foreign in my hands, but a steady rhythm guided us, his voice calm as he told me to relax. The ocean was cold, the spray kissing my skin, and I laughed, really laughed for the first time in months, the sound echoing over the waves as we glided past rocky cliffs. Gideon's laughter joined mine, warm and free, and he shouted that I was a natural, that we could race the seals if I kept it up, making me grin wider than I had in years. For a moment, I wasn't a wife, a mother, a woman trapped in routine. I was Tessa, alive, my heart pounding with a joy I'd forgotten I could feel, the water stretching endless before me. Gideon let me take the lead, his hands resting lightly on the paddle behind me, and I felt the kayak surge as I found my rhythm, the power in my arms surprising me, thrilling me. We paddled until my shoulders ached, then drifted, the kayak rocking gently, and I turned to look at him, my breath catching at the way he was watching me, his eyes soft but intense. I told him it was incredible, my voice shaking slightly, and asked how I could ever thank him for giving me this moment I'd never forget. Gideon shrugged, his smile quiet, and said I didn't have to thank him, that seeing me happy was enough, more than enough, and he meant it. I looked away, out at the horizon, the clouds parting to let a sliver of sunlight touch the water, and felt something shift inside me, a crack I couldn't mend. It wasn't just the kayak, the day, the ocean. It was Gideon, the way he saw me, remembered me, cared in ways no one else did. Not Roland, not anyone. We paddled back slowly, the silence between us comfortable but heavy, and as we dragged the kayak onto the shore, my legs wobbly from the effort, I felt his hand brush mine, steadying me. I thanked him again, my voice barely above a whisper, and he squeezed my hand, just for a second, saying anytime, Tessa, anytime, and I realized he called me by my name, not Mom. We drove home, the radio off, the hum of the engine filling the space, and I kept my eyes on the road, afraid to look at him, afraid of what I'd see, or what I'd want to see. That night, I stood in the bathroom, brushing my hair, the mirror reflecting a woman who looked alive, her cheeks flushed from the sea air, her eyes too bright. Roland was already asleep, his back to me as always, and I lingered in the doorway, watching him, wondering when I'd stopped expecting him to notice me, to care about the woman I still was. Gideon's attention filled that void, his compliments, his gifts, his fierce defense, and I hated how much I craved it, how it made me feel seen when I'd been invisible for so long. I slipped into bed, the sheets cold, and lay awake, my mind replaying the day, the kayak, the waves, Gideon's laugh, his hand on mine, and I knew I was standing on the edge of something dangerous. The house was quiet, too quiet, and I couldn't sleep, so I padded downstairs, my bare feet silent on the hardwood, hoping a glass of water would calm the storm in my chest. In the kitchen, I found Gideon leaning against the counter, a mug of tea in his hands, his eyes lifting to meet mine, a tired smile tugging at his lips as he asked if I couldn't sleep either. I shook my head, wrapping my arms around myself, and said I thought some tea might help, though I wasn't sure anything could quiet the thoughts racing through me now. He reached for the kettle, pouring water without asking, his movements slow, deliberate, like he'd done this 100 times, and maybe he had. Maybe this was who we were now. As he handed me the mug, our fingers brushed, the contact fleeting but electric, and I looked up, catching the way his gaze lingered, searching, hesitant. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the moonlight spilling through the window, and I felt the space between us shrink, the air thick with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. I should have stepped back, said good night, gone upstairs, but I didn't, because in that moment he was the only one who saw me, really saw me, and I was tired of being invisible. Neither of us spoke, the silence stretching, and I don't know who moved first. Maybe him, maybe me, but we were closer now, too close, his breath warm against my cheek, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might wake the house. It was just a moment, a fleeting pause where the world held its breath, and then I pulled back, my mug trembling in my hands, my voice a whisper as I said I should go to bed. Gideon nodded, his eyes still on me, and said good night, his voice soft but heavy, like he knew we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross, even if we hadn't done anything wrong. I climbed the stairs, my legs unsteady, and slipped into bed beside Roland, his snores a steady rhythm that felt like a wall between us forever. I stared at the ceiling, the moonlight painting shadows on the walls, and felt the weight of what had almost happened, what might still happen if I didn't find a way to stop it. Gideon saw me, remembered me, cared in ways that filled the holes Roland left, but he was my son, and I was his mother, and that truth was a line I couldn't blur, no matter how much I craved being seen. The next morning, I'd smile, make coffee, act like nothing had changed, but deep down, I knew I was different, that we were different, and I'd have to find a way to live with that. Tidehaven stretched outside, its waves crashing against the rocks, and I wondered if I could ever go back to the woman I was before Gideon's eyes found me in the dark. The morning after that moonlit kitchen moment, I woke with a heaviness in my chest, the memory of Gideon's gaze clinging to me like damp fog rolling off the Tidehaven shore. I stood at the kitchen counter, brewing coffee, my hands trembling as I measured grounds, telling myself I could pretend nothing had changed between us, that we were still just mother and son. Roland shuffled in, his eyes glued to his phone, muttering about a work email, not noticing the new blouse I'd chosen to feel something other than the guilt gnawing at my bones. I forced a smile, handed him a mug, and asked about his day, hoping routine would anchor me, but his vague reply only widened the chasm I felt growing inside our home. Gideon appeared next, his hair still damp from a shower, and when he said my blouse looked nice, his voice soft but deliberate, my stomach twisted with a mix of warmth and dread I couldn't untangle. I mumbled thanks, turning to the sink, my fingers gripping the edge as I washed dishes, praying he wouldn't linger, wouldn't say more to pull me deeper into this dangerous current. He didn't, grabbing an apple and heading out, but his glance back at me, brief and searching, left a weight I carried through the day at the bookstore, ringing up customers with a smile that felt like a lie. That evening, I sat on the porch, the ocean's roar a steady hum, when Gideon joined me, holding 2 mugs of chamomile tea, his presence both comfort and chaos. He sat close, too close, and said he'd been thinking about me, about how I deserved to be happy, not stuck in a life that dimmed my light, his words piercing like a truth I'd avoided. I stared at the horizon, my heart racing, and told him he shouldn't say things like that I was his mother, and we had to keep things clear, no matter what I felt. He nodded, silent, but his hand brushed mine, lingering a second too long, and I pulled away, standing, saying I needed air, though the night was already thick with it. Inside, I found Roland asleep in his chair, oblivious, and I realized I couldn't keep living half-seen, half-loved, but the answer wasn't with Gideon. It couldn't be, no matter how he made me feel alive. The next day, I made a choice, one I hadn't expected, driven by a clarity that cut through the fog of my longing and guilt. I enrolled in a marine biology course at the community college, something I dreamed of years ago, before marriage and motherhood buried it, telling myself I'd find myself again, not in anyone's eyes but my own. Gideon noticed the change, my focus shifting, and when I told him, his smile was proud but tinged with loss, as if he knew I was stepping back from the edge we danced on. At the course's end, I joined a research team, spending weekends on a boat, studying kelp forests, my hands steady on the nets, my heart full without needing anyone to see me. One night, alone on deck, I scattered a handful of sea glass into the waves, each piece a fragment of who I'd been, wife, mother, woman lost, and whispered to the ocean that I was enough, my voice swallowed by the tide's endless song.